the first thing when we want to talk about Indian agriculture and so on is to ask what is its structure, what does it look like? Okay. Indian agriculture, if you look at in terms of size of holdings, okay, it fundamentally is one where the marginal farmers are the most important actors. Okay. As it happens, in rural areas we also have very significant landlessness, and many of them also tend to be part-time farmers through leasing in mechanisms, right? But if you exclude them for the moment, look at only the landowners who have titles to land, etc., then we are talking of almost 85% of holdings in the country, right, and holders in the country both, who constitute what you can consider marginal and small, right, so close to 85-86%, right. Now, if you include landless in this category, then it would be almost, high 90s, right? But then again, the estimation there would be somewhat problematic because, we don't really have data on tenancy in this country. Fundamentally, we are looking at an agrarian system which is consisting of marginal and small farmers, right? If you look at just their per capita holding, right, holdings for such categories, it actually falls below 1 hectare, well below 1 hectare, right? If you in fact look at all categories taken together, we are just about 1.16, right, in terms of the size of per holding. Okay, so even if you're looking at the better off guys, right, and you put them in this overall bracket, the aggregate figure gives you something which is obviously telling us that Indian economy is one which is driven by Indian agriculture, which is driven by small farmers and marginal farmers and so on. Right? Of course, it is true that the top 5%, they account for close to 17-18% of land and so on. What can be done there, issues of equity, land reforms, all those are issues which I am not getting into right now. If you have any questions, we can come back to that. But the first point to note is that this is the character of our agriculture, that it has, the key actor there is marginal and small farmers, and they have, this is the second feature which we need to talk about, they have been hit disproportionately hard in the last 25 years or so, right, which is the period of what we generally describe as economic reforms, and I'll talk about that in greater detail in due course, right. What has been happening to the share of agriculture in GDP? Now, if you look at the last sort of, let's say, 60 odd years, right, starting soon after independence, the share of agriculture in GDP was slightly more than half. It was about 52% or so, right. If you look at the most recent estimates, we are talking of about 13 to 14%. That is, share of agriculture in GDP has come down very, very significantly. Overall national income of India. Now, in itself, this need not be a terrible thing, right? Because in the process of economic transformation, this is a standard kind of trajectory. It happens all over the world. The share of agriculture in GDP comes down. But what also happens in the case of successful economic transformation story is that dependence on agriculture also goes down. That is, for livelihood, for occupation and so on and so forth. Now if you look at that, then the decline in terms of dependence has been much less than what has happened with respect to the share in output. Which fundamentally means what? If you think in terms of simply rural and urban, or agriculture and non-agriculture, right? Those who are still dependent on agriculture, relatively speaking, their situation has increasingly become worse and worse and worse compared to those who are part of non-agriculture, right? Now that is a huge gap, and that gap has been rising, and that gap in the most recent years, last 25 years in particular, right, is something which has assumed frightening proportions. I'll give you some numbers to give you a good sense of that, right? So we are talking about 13-14% in terms of share in GDP, but we are talking of more than 50% of the workforce still being part of agriculture, and close to 65 to 70% population still dependent primarily on agriculture, right? We are talking of more than or close to 3/4 of the population still being in rural activities, rural areas, rural activities and so on, primarily. In fact, as of today, it has sort of become a very common feature that most workers in the bottom 90% of this country, right, almost 90% of this country, they do not depend on any one single occupation because they cannot afford to do that. What do? They do multitasking. That's a respectable word for it, right? But fundamentally, what are we talking about? Scrounging for wages in different segments and different sectors. Jan Bremen has a very nice phrase for it: wage hunters and gatherers, right? So that is something which then becomes a matter of serious concern. So share of agriculture going down in itself is not a serious concern, as I said, in GDP, right? This is what happened in the USA, this is what has happened in Europe and so on. If you look at share of agriculture in GDP, it's less than 2%, 3%, 1%. Likewise, the dependence or the workforce there is less than 2%, 3%, 1%. Well, perfectly fine, no issues. There are different kinds of problems there. We can talk about that if you're interested. But that at least would be a kind of successful economic transformation. But in our case, that is not the story. Okay. Now, if that is the case, then how do we address some of our major concerns? Would be an obvious policy question, and I'll come to that in a moment, right? The third feature that I want to talk to you about at this point in time in terms of understanding the structure of agriculture is that in the more recent years, there has been a shift in cropping pattern, right? In the aggregate, we make a distinction between food crops versus cash crops. Now, that's not a, very smart distinction, right? Ideally, one should be calling it food crops and non-food crops, okay? So, non-food would include a whole range of raw materials which get used in multiple activities. But as I said, this distinction gets made between food and non-food also because the analysts are trying to highlight how there is a shift away from some of the core foods to those which get used for marketable sort of options, for instance, floriculture, flowers, which is becoming a significant thing, right? Fruits which people grow in large parts of this country which they never consume, right? They end up somewhere in India's urban superstores, malls, etc. And a good deal of that actually ends up in global superstores. In fact, if you go to, let's say, a mall in Berlin, right, or New York or Washington or wherever, right? And if you look at the agricultural products there, okay, 70% approximate comes from developing countries, right? Now that has been a big feature of the last 30, 40 years, and this is something which is part of that whole push for globalization by developed countries to have fresh food on their shelves, right? Now, they have it, let's not grudge them what they have, but then that also has massive consequences for people in developing countries. Africa, which used to be by and large sort of cereal secure, has become massive sort of cereal insecure continent today, right? But this is something which has happened in India. If you look at total area under food crops, sort of that has tended to come down somewhat. If you look at also the net sown area, right, there is a sort of small dip, almost 3 million hectares, right, which means what? Land is being used for non-agricultural purposes, right? So this is what this shift away from net sown area to, let's say, a number of other activities is something which is, as regards, other features of, let's say, structure of Indian agriculture, things like irrigation and so on, things have tended to come under a lot of pressure in the last 3 decades or so. So we had the rate of progress, for instance, towards making agriculture sort of water secure was faster during 50s, 60s and 70s compared to what has happened in the more recent times, right? So even today, assured irrigation is something which is a luxury for most Indian farmers, right? The fourth feature is that if you look at what is the gap between the potential by standard scientific calculations and so on, what can our land produce if there is complementary package available to us, and what is the achievement, right? It is a story that is not very inspiring, right? Just to give you some numbers to help put things in perspective, if you compare, let's say, per unit of land, what is, let's say, wheat output, rice output, maize output, and so on and so forth, the major sort of productions that we have in the realm of cereals, right? Roughly we are somewhere around 50% compared to even East Asia, right? I'm not comparing ourselves with the most advanced countries there, right? But even with respect to East Asia, we are somewhere roughly around 50% or so. In other words, the gap, even though there has been significant progress over the last 60, 70 years, one should not say that nothing happened, right? I mean, compared to what the story was, 1947, and if you look at, let's say, 1900 to 1947, Indian agriculture was growing at a rate which was almost zero. It was 0.11%, right, for a 50-year period, right? It was nothing, okay? That also tells you why. Around 1900, our per capita food production every year was approximately 200 kg, and by the time of infamous Bengal famine, it had come down to 136 kg per person. right? So there's a massive squeeze of Indian agriculture and so on, right? Compared to that, during the best phase of post-independence era, we touched approximately 180 kg per person, right? This is 1980s, and I'll come to that in a minute, what have been the trends there. But this is something which is worth keeping in mind, that even prior to the recent period, which has put Indian agriculture under massive stress, right, we could have done much better. The question to ask is, why didn't we do much better, right? Okay, so we have different phases and so on. We did reasonably well in some phases, not so well during particular sub-phases, etc. But in general, one would argue that we were way below the potential, right? Even before the so-called economic reforms period begins, right? During the period of reforms, things have become much worse, okay? If you look at the numbers and so on and so forth. So these are some of the, basic features with which, relating to the structure of Indian agriculture, with which we should start. Now let me come to what has happened during the period of reforms, and why do we call it that of sort of a crisis, at least massive stress, if not crisis, okay? Now, I mentioned this figure relating to per person total number of kgs as regards, if you add up all our, agricultural commodities and so on, that takes almost a nosedive from about 180, and it comes around 150 during a period of 15 years, starting early 90s and early years of 2000, right? 2004-05 or so. So total cereal production, that is what I am referring to, okay? So that comes down very significantly, right? After that, there is some improvement, okay? 2004-05 to about 9, 10, 11, etc., and we'll sort of try and see what explains that improvement, right? But again, it's not something which comes anywhere close to 180 or so. So we continue to be well below what we had achieved as our peak in the period since independence, right? Incidentally, it is still well below 1900, the year 1900, when it was, during the British India, when it was 200 kg, right? So in that sense, if you put all these things in perspective, these numbers in perspective, you can get a good sense of sort of the policy gaps or performance gaps and so on, and the policies which might explain, etc. So let me give you some growth rates of production of some of the major cereals, pulses, and total food grains, right? Now, if you look at the annual average during the first decade when the planning begins, right? Rice was 5.52, wheat was 6.02, coarse cereals was 5. This is annual rate of growth during the first decade. That is 50-51 to 59-60, okay? Total cereals, it was 5.19, pulses 4.83, total food grains 5.08. Next decade, sort of the total cereals, it comes down from 5.19 to 3.62. Total cereals. Total food grains from 5.08 to 3.25. The next decade, 70-71 to 79-80, it comes down further to 1.99 for total cereals. Total food grains, it comes down to 1.58, and in fact for pulses, it's negative 1.99, right? Now remember, 70s is the decade of Green Revolution. In spite of that, imagine what would have happened if we didn't have Green Revolution, right? in spite of Green Revolution, we see that there is a very significant decline. Okay? In fact, some of you probably would know that 65, 66, 64, 65 and 65, 66, these 2 years saw a contraction in food output by 20% in a country which was in many ways living from what is known as ship to mouth. Right? We were dependent at that point in time on the infamous PL 480, Public Law 480. We were getting a kind of wheat which was largely used as animal feed in the US, and US was being very generous in shipping that to us. And in fact, it even threatened to withdraw that when we had military engagement with Pakistan, the unfortunate 65 engagement, right? Now all this is the context of the Green Revolution, okay? In fact, in 10 out of 17 major states at that point in time, we had major food riots. So we need to sort of, be very, very sensitive to the backdrop of why there was a rush to do something. And one of the major achievements of Mrs. Gandhi, late Indira Gandhi, was exactly this. During a short period, she was able to sort of, at least stall that deadly decline. Okay? By doing what? Pushing for Green Revolution and a number of other things which were connected with that. If you look at all these sort of futurologists writing about India around 1970, they had given up. They had said, this country is gone, it's finished. It will be consumed by its own food riots. Okay, so that was the kind of dire prediction which was very common around 1970 or so. Right? But by mid-70s, India could say, no, we are still there. Right? So Green Revolution had all kinds of negative consequences as well. So 70s and then you have 80s. So 80s is the decade when you see when the Green Revolution spread to rest of the country and many other crops. So it started with wheat and maize, and then it spreads to paddy. And with spread to paddy, then it becomes a pan-Indian Green Revolution, right? Because, wheat and paddy are the two major crops in terms of cereals that we have. Anyway, so 80s as a decade emerges as the best decade after the first decade in terms of growth rates for total cereals, total food grains and so on. So if you look at the numbers, total cereals, the growth rate now is 4.98. This is 1980s, okay? And total food grains 4.96. So roughly same as what we had in the first decade, right? And this was because of the spread of Green Revolution, right? And a number of policies associated with that, and I'll come to some of those issues in a minute, right? If you look at the next phase, which is 1991 to 2000 or so, 1991, 2000, okay, there is almost a halving of the growth rate compared to what we had achieved in 80s, right? It becomes 2.29, right? That is for total cereals and total food grains. It comes down from 4.96 to 2.18. It's less than half, both these numbers, right? And the next decade, total cereals 0.87, total food grains 0.93. Right? Now, I hope in terms of numbers you have got a sense of the crisis in the aggregate, what is happening? Right? Now, imagine close to 70% of the population dependent on agriculture, right? And if you look at what is happening to their, and this is the prime activity through which they get their income, what happens to them during this great period of shining, rising, whatever, different people give it different names, no? At different points in time, right? That's the tragedy of rural India. Okay? If you look at the most recent stats, look at what is the average household farm income, average household farm income per month, right? It's roughly 3,500. This is the average household income. Now, these numbers should shake us, right? I mean, most of us probably spend that in a week on our personal virtues and vices. Isn't that so? And the entire household has to live on that kind of, yeah. Some of you may have heard of something called NCEUS, National Commission for the Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, headed by late Professor Arjun Sengupta. And for 2004-05, Professor Sengupta's calculation was that using the standard data, that close to 80% of the population in this country lived on a daily per capita consumption, okay, daily per capita consumption, which included every kind of consumption. It included your food, your health, your shelter, your education, all consumptions. So 80% of the population lived on a consumption, daily per capita consumption figure of rupees 20 or less. Right? If we take into account inflation, etc., if we are very generous, we can say, okay, that 20 today will be 35 or so. Right? If we overestimate inflation and so on, sort of maximum 40. Now, what would you do? Suppose you are given 40 rupees and you don't have a shelter and you don't have anything. You have to fend for all your needs with that amount. You might as well disappear, right, from the scene. It can be that bad. And most of them are who? People in rural areas. Most of them are what is described as working poor. Right? They keep breaking their back on a daily basis. Right? Some of them are in urban areas, but to a large extent, all right. So, what have I shared with you? That if we look at growth rates, things went down, okay, very, very considerably during the last. Now, there was one period which was a relatively better period, 2004-05 to 9-10, okay, and then in a couple of years when we have had good monsoons, things have been reasonably good, I mean, relatively speaking. But otherwise, if you're looking at the entire period, as I said, things are pretty dismal. But one of the major things there is, what has been happening to yield growth rates, right? That is a good indicator of what we are doing, okay? So I gave you overall growth rate, but let me just give you growth rate of yield. That is per unit of land, right? Area is not expanding. What is happening to productivity, okay? So if you look at figures for that, let me just give you 80s and the the last decade which I mentioned, 2001 to 9-10, okay. So if it, in 80s, rice yield growth rate was 5.5, in the first decade of this century it was 1.1. For wheat, it comes down from 4.2 to 0.2, okay. Coarse cereals, sort of, it comes down, but not that significantly, from approximately 4 to roughly 2.5. So it's still sort of, significantly down, but not that depressing story there. Overall, from 4.7 to 1. If you take all cereals together, if you take total food grains, it comes down from 4.6 to 0.8, right? Why is it that total food grains have gone down even more sharply in terms of yield growth rates? Because of massive decline in productivity of pulses, right? It comes down from 4 annual growth rate, 4%, to minus 5.8%.
So which are the decades that you're comparing?
80s and then 2002, 2010. So, so I just giving you the best decade of Green Revolution and the subsequent, just to capture that, right? As I said, 80s is the best decade for Indian agriculture, right? It generated a number of significant costs in terms of environment and climate and so on, which we can talk about, but that was also the best decade otherwise, okay? And then we talk of the pulses crisis. As you know, that has been one of the major problems. That again tells you that obviously public policy or policy making vis-a-vis agriculture was completely innocent of some of these major challenges which we need to confront, right? And we continue to neglect it, right? So yield increases, we notice, sort of more or less become, okay. What also happens during this period is that if you look at the standard data sources, there is a very significant decline in households which have any operational holding of their own, right? That is operational holding. I am not talking of ownership holding. Operational holding includes own holding as well as the area that you lease in. Okay, so if you include both, that is those who are landless but they can lease in and so on and so forth. So if you look at what has happened in terms of operational holdings, right, there is a very significant decline, let's say between early years of 90s, when it was approximately, and those who had some operational holding, from about 43% to about 36.5%, right? Now, two things are happening. One, people are losing their land in terms of ownership, according to a study done by my colleague Professor Vikas Rawal, that comes down by almost 10 percentage points. Now, why do people sell land? In India, unless you're about to die, you would not want to sell your land. Or unless you have to cremate your dead, then again you sell your land. After that is the turn of the wedding of the daughter, right? One of the reasons why daughters are considered a curse is fundamentally the fat dowry, and even amongst the lowest economic social segments, that does become a problem, right? And then the fourth thing is serious illness, okay? So these are some of the things when you part with your land, right? 10% of households in the last 25 years or so have sold their land. Right? It's a very, very depressing, it's a very bleak picture that we're talking about. Question to ask is, why did they do it? As I said, these were some of the things which are happening. And earlier I gave you the picture of what's happening to productivity and so on and so forth. That's the kind of crisis we are talking about. So imagine, for 75%, that's the sort of story. For the remaining 25% or so that average 60% over the 10-year period has gone where? To that remaining 25%. Right? And that is the widening of the gulf, one of the major drivers of people getting pushed out. Right? And then this whole business of pull-push, I'll come to that in a minute while talking about migration. Okay? But so that's the sort of story so they're losing land, right, as a result of the kind of stress that agriculture has witnessed. And there are a number of factors which explain what is happening. What is it that I would like to emphasize? Public policies. I mean, after all, we are talking of what is happening because of so-called economic reforms. No? So, economic reforms basically mean a set of public policies, macroeconomic policies and so on. Now, 2-3 things are relatively more important to highlight than others. So let me begin with those. When we talk of economic reforms, externally, what does it mean? That we open up. Right? India becomes relatively more integrated, Indian agriculture becomes relatively more integrated with the global economy as a whole. So if that happens, then obviously whatever is happening in the rest of the world is going to impact on India in terms of prices and some other important correlates, etc. If you look at, let's say, 97 or so, 96, 97, prices of a number of commodities were primary commodities, agricultural commodities, seem to be very attractive globally. Okay? And then you have this whole process of integration of the global economy and so on. Next 3, 4, 5 years, prices crashed like nothing. Primary commodity prices, agricultural prices crashed. Right? So for a period of roughly 6, 7 years, we see that tendency. This is also the period when there is much more integration in the global economy and particularly of agriculture. Right? People in India were told that, look, farmers were told, you will benefit because of opening up, because then you can get much better prices. The opposite happened. Right? This is the period when you start hearing of something which has never happened in peacetime anywhere in the world. People killing themselves on a mass scale. Peasant suicides, farmer suicides. It is unprecedented in the history of humanity. The numbers, the scale, and the explanation is simple. Public policies. One, as I said, prices had crashed. Okay? They thought they were investing in gold, but it turned out to be sand. Right? So if you look at, what is happening to investment support, okay, it comes down very significantly from about 18% to about 12% or so. Okay? I'm talking about the support from the union government, its budgets and so on and so forth, of their of the country's total budgetary support, okay, through the union government. Now, that's a very, very significant kind of decline. What is gross capital formation, right? This is agriculture and allied sector in total gross capital formation, okay? This comes down by almost 1/3, from 18.4 to 6.2. The first year is your 81, the next one is 10 to 12, around that period, 2010-12, around that time. This is a total budget, in that the gross capital formation for agriculture and allied activities, right? Investment, as I said, is one of the big things. If that is drying up, like you saw the figures, okay? Credit. What happens? There is a massive squeeze for credit through scheduled commercial banks, okay, over the same period. Now, I had said that Mrs. Gandhi did a number of wonderful things around the time of Green Revolution. Two of those wonderful things, and those two, till date, in my assessment of how India has done with respect to policy, continue to be the two best things. One was nationalization of banks, because once you do that, then through that, you can channelize whatever you consider your national objectives, right? Second, after the nationalization, she had in place what was known as priority sector lending. So banks were told that a certain amount has to go to agriculture, certain amount has to go to rickshaw pullers. I think rickshaws have disappeared, those maybe tricycle rickshaws have disappeared from the fancy areas of Hyderabad. But if you go to maybe some of the older, there, do we have rickshaws or they have gone, finished? Okay. In Delhi, even today you will notice some of these cycle rickshaws. On the back side it says, hypothecated to the Bank of India, to State Bank of India, to Punjab National Bank, and so on and so forth. That was part of that priority sector lending. Okay. So, close to 40% of lending had to go to priority sectors. Okay. And there, it was very clear that it has to go directly. You can't use all kinds of indirect means and so on. The UPA government, UPA 1, did something which was, it thought was very clever, right? It, in fact, changed the definitions of direct and indirect credit to agriculture. So if Mr. Ambani wants a loan in the name of agriculture, he can get it in the name of rural infrastructure, right? You would be surprised to know that the two sort of cities which account for highest share of agricultural loans are Delhi and Chandigarh. We do a lot of agriculture in Delhi, right? And that happened precisely because of this reclassification or misclassification. So a whole lot of indirect activities, indirect lending to agriculture, if you keep increasing the range of that, right? And you say, no, it's agricultural lending. So banks are happy. These borrowers are very happy. And agriculture is very unhappy, right? So two things happened. There was a squeeze in general. Number two, this switch direct indirect became a problem, right? What happens when direct sources dry up? What do? You go to informal sources, you go to money lenders. So suddenly if you look at 1990s and 2000s, there is a massive increase in the share of lending by what is known as informal sources. Even agricultural laborers, for instance, during the pre-reform era, close to sort of, as per the official data, close to 80-90% of them could access formal sources. And that number now is much less, somewhere around 50-60% as per the official data. Right? So even the most vulnerable category, the official data tell us, were in a position to access formal sources. Now, if you go to informal sources, what is one of the first things that happens? The cost of credit is much higher. So from the formal source, you can get it for 7, 8, 9, 10%. From the informal, that's annual rate of interest. From the informal, 7, 8, 9, 10% is monthly. Right? So I did a study last year in some villages where the average rate was 120%. Right? Various studies, if you do a survey, the range is from 60% to 240% annual rates of interest. Which activity can get return which is anywhere around 60%? No activity. So if I want to buy, let's say, a Mercedes Benz, I go to my bank, I get a credit at the rate of 10% per annum. A farmer who wants to plant the next crop goes to the informal lender, cannot get it less than 60%. Crop fails, what happens? She kills herself. That is the story. Public investment is going down, formal credit is going down, international prices are so volatile that you don't know what might happen, what might hit you tomorrow. And these are some of the, very obvious channels. As I said, I wanted to highlight some of the most obvious things. Right? If this happens, you will see growing landlessness. You will see a massive squeeze on the income of farmers. Right? And as I said, it can end up with the sort of tragedy that has been unfolding in India on a scale which is unprecedented. Right? Now that's the nature of agrarian crisis.